The recently concluded G20 has been making headlines everywhere. By now, all of us know what all have been achieved. In today's video, we are going to go back in time and trace the historical journey of the various agreements that were jointly signed and understand why it was so critical to jointly agree on the issues. We will understand three of the most important aspects of the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration from the Global South's perspective. Number 1. Accelerating progress on Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. What are Sustainable Development Goals and its importance? Number 2. Green Development Pact for a Sustainable Future. Why has climate change become such a pressing issue for all countries and the finance required for achieving this? And number 3. Multilateral institutions for the 21st century. What are the multilateral institutes, its history and role for achieving sustainable goals, climate control, and the rising debt problems of the Global South? So let us first understand what is the Global South. Despite how it sounds, it's not really a geographical term. Many countries included in the Global South are in the Northern Hemisphere, such as India and China. Similarly, Australia and New Zealand, both in the Southern Hemisphere, are not in the Global South. So basically, the Global South refers to various countries that are developing, less developed, or underdeveloped. They are poorer, have higher level of income inequality, and suffer lower life expectancy and harsh living conditions than countries in the Global North, which are the richer nations that are located mostly in North America, Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. As of early 2022, the list includes 78 countries, all of which are referred to as the Group of 77 and China. You can pause this video and see the list of countries belonging to the Global South. But why is there an increasing interest in the Global South? The World Bank has acknowledged a shift in wealth from North Atlantic to Asia-Pacific region. Projections indicate that by 2030, 3 of the 4 largest economies will belong to the Global South countries, with China and India leading the way. Number 3, Asian nations are predicted to play a significant role in what experts call the Asian century. Number 4, there is a talk of post-Western world as the influence of Global South challenges the historical dominance of the Global North. Now let us understand in details the reasons why a joint declaration on Green Development Pact for Sustainable Future is so crucial in today's world.
Day after day, country after country, the world is witnessing soaring mercury while rainfalls break records.
Over the past few weeks, we've been reporting extensively on the heat waves that have hit large areas of Europe, the United States, and parts of Asia.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Climate changes.
Climate change.
Climate change is here, it is terrifying, and it is just the beginning. The era of global warming has ended, the era of global boiling has arrived.
Most of these revolve around climate change. So let us look where the world and particularly the Global South stands at present in terms of climate change. The Global South is experiencing the climate crisis in terribly disruptive ways. It is very common nowadays to hear about destructive heat waves, cloudbursts, landslides, drought, heavy rainfall, causing devastating floods, forest fires, etc. It is estimated that nearly $1.3 trillion has been wiped away in the last decade because of climate change. And this equals to 0.2% of world GDP per year. According to the United Nations, half the world's population now live in the climate danger zone, where people are 15 times more likely to die from climate impacts compared to rich countries. What is the effect of these climate changes on GDP? Since pre-industrialization, that is from 1850 till today, the temperature has increased by 1.2 degrees. According to World Economic Forum, temperature rise will have the following impacts on global GDP by 2050. Below 2 degrees 4%, 2 degrees 11%, 2.6 degrees 14%, 3.2 degrees 18%. The impact of climate change has been forecasted to be the hardest hit for Asian economies, with a 5.5% hit to GDP in the best case scenario and 26.5% hit in a severe scenario. The Swiss Re Institute warns that the largest impact of climate change is that it could wipe off up to 18% of GDP of the worldwide economy by 2050. In 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) was created with 198 nations joining the convention. In order to prevent this massive impact on GDP, 194 countries and the European Union signed the Paris Agreement in December 2015, where the world's nations have committed to limit the increase in global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Now, what are the reasons for this climate change? Developing countries have repeatedly pointed out that Western countries, which industrialized much earlier and often at the expense of the global South, are responsible for the bulk of this global cumulative environmental damage. In fact, it is estimated that global North is responsible for 92% of CHG emissions, with the United States emitting 26% and Europe 22%. In contrast, the entire continent of Africa contributes just 3.8%. Moreover, corporations and government from the global North have exported their climate footprints by setting up factories, offices, and other infrastructures abroad. For example, American companies like Apple, IBM, Walmart, Amazon setting up their operations in developing countries like China, India, Vietnam, etc. Accordingly, developing countries or the global South demand climate compensation from the wealthier West in the shape of funds that would help the global South meet CHG emission goals, industrialize in sustainable methods, and have a high resilience for impending climate emergencies. At the 15th Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC in Copenhagen in 2009, developed countries committed to a collective goal of mobilizing $100 billion per year till 2025. But why is this climate finance required? To keep the planet from warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, most countries, including the US, have goals to reach net zero by 2050. To achieve decarbonization, all aspects of the economy must change, from how energy is generated and how we produce and deliver goods and services to how lands are managed. According to United Nations Environment Programme, countries may need to spend around $300 billion a year by 2030 and $500 billion by 2050. But why is this funding required, and what will the global South do with this money? The carbon dioxide and methane emissions that are warming the planet come largely from 5 sources. Number 1, power generation. Number 2, industry. Number 3, transport. Number 4, buildings. And number 5, agriculture and land use. Power generation produces electricity. Currently, most of the power generation in the global South occurs by burning fossil fuels like coal and is responsible for 30% of global CO2 emissions. With the global population expected to reach 10 billion in 2060 from 8.1 billion currently, demand for electricity will grow. Power generation must come from renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, hydropower, geothermal and biomass. This will require financing for infrastructure building, renewable power capacity, new electricity grids and large-scale battery plants to store clean energy. Number 2, industrial processes. This sector is one of the hardest to decarbonize because steel, cement and chemical production may require temperatures of 1600 degrees Celsius or more, which are easily produced by fossil fuel combustion but difficult to achieve through electrification. To truly decarbonize this industry, production processes will need to be completely redesigned, which requires huge investments. Number 3, transportation. Transportation, including aviation and sea, generate 19% of CO2 emissions.
And to align our policies and our goals and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050.
To reach net zero in the US, 50% of all new vehicles must be electric, and this electricity must be generated from renewable energy or hydrogen. More EVs on the road will necessitate expanding the EV charging station across the country as well as developing better and cheaper batteries. Number 4, buildings. Buildings are responsible for 6% of CO2 emissions. Existing and older buildings need to be retrofitted with cooling and heating systems running on renewable energy, implementing smart energy management systems and creating incentives for energy efficient appliances and electric cook stoves. Number 5, agriculture. Reduction of carbon emission in agriculture requires investment in sustainable farming practices such as regenerative agriculture that enhances soil carbon storage and protects biodiversity.
इस तिरंगे की साक्षी में नेशनल हाइड्रोजन मिशन की घोषणा कर रहा हूं.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has launched the National Hydrogen Mission and International Solar Alliance as part of these initiatives and has pledged to reach net zero by 2070. Now let us look at the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals aims to transform our world. They are a call to action to end poverty and inequality, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy health, justice, and prosperity. In 2015, all the countries in the United Nations adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It sets out 17 goals aimed at ending poverty in all its forms. You can see the 17 goals in the images like no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, etc. The 2023 Financing for Sustainable Development report finds that SDG financing needs are growing, but development financing is not keeping pace. The war in Ukraine, sharp increases in the food and energy price,
what does this increase in inflation actually mean?
And rapidly tightening financial conditions have increased hunger and poverty and reversed progress on the SDGs.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi calls for reform in global financial institutions like the World Bank.
Now let us understand what are the multilateral and bilateral institutes. Two of the most influential international financial institutions are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These institutions were founded in 1944 and designed by and for the industrialized countries of the post-World War II period. The first criticism of the World Bank and IMF is that they are undemocratic and that economically poorer countries are structurally underrepresented in decision-making process. Second, the economic policy conditions they promote and often attach as part of loans that undermine the sovereignty of borrower nations. For example, most of the loans given to African nations include political preconditions such as human rights or judicial reform. Third, the interest rate on loans is decided by the credit rating, which in turn depends on the economic health of the country. Least developed countries, like the countries in Africa who are most susceptible to climate change, pay the highest interest on loan, whereas the richer countries pay less interest. According to the UN, least developed countries face international rates of up to 8% as compared to 1% in many wealthier countries. In 2022, global public debt reached a record $92 trillion US. Developing countries owe almost 30% of the total, of which roughly 70% is attributable to China, India, and Brazil. Injustices in the international financial system have profound impacts. Even if many countries want to invest in climate action that benefits the world as a whole, many cannot afford to do so. Currently, 52 developing countries are suffering severe debt problems. They are home to 40% of all people living in extreme poverty. Half of them are among the world's most climate vulnerable nations. Moreover, in 2019-20, over 60% of the climate finance was in way of loans, 7% at low interest loans, and only 5% in the form of grants. Avoiding the worst impacts of the climate change could require $4.3 trillion a year by 2030. Costs will only escalate the more the earth continues to warm. So to conclude, the G20 presidency of India fell during a period of intense turmoil in global economic ties. The G20 has managed to reaffirm, recognize, and further commit and get a joint declaration on all these critically important and urgent issues of the Global South. In order to increase the majority of the Global South, the African Union has been admitted in the group. The Global Biofuel Alliance is targeted towards decreasing dependence on fossil fuels and a step towards decreasing carbon footprint.
At the G20 summit, a big announcement has been made, a historic agreement unveiled on a major connectivity project, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor.
The economic corridor linking India, Middle East and the Europe will increase trade, which will increase the income of nations. When the economy improves, debt burdens will gradually reduce and nations can start diverting funds from public expenditures to climate and sustainable development goals.